Well, been in Strathmere since purchased the house in 1980. Before that, I was with my brother-in-law into a rental house behind the house that Coffey built. And I was so enamored with Strathmere by the time I finished that I walked around town to ask people if they were planning to sell, because at that point Bruce was here, but he was just renting. There was no house sold without it going from one person to another. And so I found a house down beach, really loved it. It was $90,000 on the beach. And I came down in the middle of the winter to meet with the guy, and I was ready to buy it until I drove by and I saw this house on the point. And I said, ooh, that's a much better house. Not the house, the houses were all the same back then, they were cottages. But I didn't buy the house down beach. I negotiated with the estate to buy this house for, the king's ransom of $130,000. And all of the residents of Strathmere said to me, "You're nuts. No house had ever sold for over $100,000. So I said, I really love the location. And so that's how it started. It became our summer home. I spent every day for 7 years working on it. I never went to the beach. It was a constant job to get it to the way we wanted it. At which point my wife at the time finished law school, and the only place she got a job was in Atlantic City. So we sold our properties in Pennsylvania and we moved down here full time and changed the little Brighton Shore cottage, one of about only 4 or 5 that were left, into a more substantial house for year-round living. And so we were living here year-round starting probably in 1970, 1987, yeah, 1987 we started because we finished the house. And I lived year-round here until about 1993. And they were some of the best years of my life. Living in Strathmere full-time was quite an experience. And so the house that we built, I was really happy with. We made it look like an early American seashore house on the front. But when you get inside, and all of the amenities were, modern for 1987. And I liked that surprise because, you walk in the front and then you walk up the steps and then boom, you have this fantastic back wall is all glass up the point and up. Yeah, you can show it. I don't know if it'll turn out. And so you see right up the coast, and you see how strange it is that the coast turns all the way out to the right to Atlantic City. And it's like Oz, it just glows there in the night. And you also get to see the bay, and you get to see the inlet, and you get to see the ocean. So it's been a wonderful, wonderful home to have. Lived here year-round, and then I became the luckiest man in the world and met my wife, Marie. And that started to pull me away from Strathmere because when I was here full-time, I was deeply involved. I was in the fire company. I was the president of the Strathmere Improvement Association for many years. And I developed a lot of good friends. And the friends were the original people of Strathmere. People like Betty Disher and Elizabeth Bergus and Miss Eggy, Dave Mead, and Helen Williams. And I was the kid. And it was really funny because we started a little group called the Strathmere Symphonies. And you know, there were a couple harmonica players. There was Helen played the keyboard. I played the ukulele. And we just get together and, you know, we jam. It was really, really fun. And somehow or another, these older people, for me at that time, were really cool. Strathmere was a very unusual place back then. You know, when you look at Donald Bergus as the you know, ambassador to the Sudan, and you look at you know, other people who lived here. Major Bowles lived on the bay for a while. It was really unusual. It pulled a very eclectic group of people, but they were people who just related well to everybody, because almost all the rest of the houses were working class people from Philadelphia who were able to pay, you know, a tiny little money to get a house here when Avalon and Stone Harbor and Ocean City were unaffordable. So it was a really good place to live if you felt, you know, simpatico with those kinds of people. And so I enjoyed it enormously, but then when I got married to Maria and moved to Delran, New Jersey, we became less attached, which was a bit of a shame, but understandable because the grandkids came and Marie's mother needed to be taken care of full time, and so that we weren't really getting down here as much as I would like to. And so when you're not, then you're kind of always coming down to, you know, solve a problem. And living where we live, you all know that the problems come and go, and it takes a lot of attention. And so, unfortunately, I changed the complexion of the town changed, as it must, and there had been a building ban, because when I first came down, the water company was bankrupt, and so nobody was paying for water, but the water wasn't starting to work, and finally the water got to the point where it wasn't really safely potable, and nobody was doing anything, so the Strathmere Improvement Association did something, and we got the state and the county and the township all to understand that this is a problem. And they jumped to, and they got the New Jersey American Water Company to come in and redo the entire water. Some other little anecdotes, you know, they built a big water tower, and the residents voted to not put the name Strathmere on top of it because we didn't want anybody to know we were here. Another thing happened. There was a reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer. I could remember his name, but now it's
Clark de Leon?
Yeah, de Leon, right. Yeah. He came down and loved it so much that he would write a series of articles for 2 weeks to the Inquirer from an undisclosed location. So it was the other thing is the idea of beach tags would come up all the time, and you know, there would be one group that would be really want them because they wanted to keep the riffraff out, and the other group didn't want them because they didn't want to have little beach Nazis running around saying, "Do you have, you know, your tag?" And fortunately, the opposing group has won to the point where we're very unique in New Jersey. If I can do a little bit of an ad here, I still really oppose it because there is a natural situation in Strathmere, and that is there is no parking. And so you're only going to get so many people. And when that many people are here, the rest of them don't stay because they can't. And so the beach is It's never crowded. And I think that as many young, highly, privileged children today have more tattoos than the people that we would complain about in the past being on the beach with their tattoos or drinking their beers. That's part of what Strathmere was. I mean, we have a wonderful, wonderful lifeguard organization now. When I moved here, the lifeguard organization was as laid back as you could possibly imagine. They were really good lifeguards, but they didn't enforce anything else. I mean, that was it. They were here to save your life. They weren't here to beat you up for the strange, fire you might have had on the beach at one time or another. It was just, I'm sounding like an old fart. I know I am. But it really was different back then. I think that the differences now are really good differences. They are good compromise between our local towns that we have. I think this town has maintained its character of having people who are here because they like the environment here. I think when people come to Strathmere and they realize how it is different, they either move out fast or they become a part of it. And I don't know many of the new people, unfortunately, but I go to the 4th of July parade every year, and that's enough to tell me that these people understand Strathmere. They might have more money, and they might, but you don't move to Strathmere if you want to put on airs. Some of the other things that happened, which were wonderful, there were parties that went on, and some of them still do. One of them is the North of the Blinker Light Party, which was started by Betty Disher many, many years ago. And there was another party that happened when the Purple Martins would come. And the best one, though, was the Cabin Fever Party. And the Cabin Fever Party happened in February, in the depths of the winter. And we would get together and count how many people actually were in town. And usually 2/3 of the people who lived in town were at the party, and that was 15 people. And Betty Disher ran it as she ran most things, like, the military person she was. And one of the things that you had to do was you had to bring all of the cordials that you never drink and put them on her dining room table. And so there were, it was unbelievable how many things you could have drunk that night. The next thing that you had to do was you had to entertain. So you were expected to get up and, sing a song, read a poem, make up some lyrics to something. It didn't matter, but you had to do that. And the most important thing you had to do was show up. Because if you didn't, you were never invited back. It's just a sign of what Betty Disher was like. So everybody always came, except one year, poor Helen Williams was so sick. She had a terrible, terrible cold. And so her daughter, Tony, came with a karaoke machine. And Helen Williams had made a song specifically for that night. And it was... I feel so sick. Yeah, I feel so sick. I feel like shit. It just went on. There were verse after verse. It was so wonderful. We all had tears in our eyes. Yeah. So, well, it was a good time, and there's lots of other stories. I don't know that I can dredge them up, at the spur of the moment. But This was a wonderful place to live full-time. It was and is.
Sunrise service.
Hmm?
The sunrise service on Easter.
Oh yeah, the Easter sunrise services, which they still do. Yeah, they were great.
Talk a little bit about your love of kayaking.
Ooh, my love of kayaking. I bought a kayak back in probably 1982, and I was the only kayaker anywhere, particularly as a sea kayaker, and I really enjoyed it, and I got Greg Bennett interested in it. And so, and there was Mike Dolan who lived here at the time, and the three of us, or two of us, or just one at a time, would go out year-round. It was just mystical. You're so close to the water, you are one with the water, and you're not wet. But what I found most interesting was it had some mystical quality, because what happens is that you get out there and pretty soon you're talking with nature. And a couple of stories are wonderful. One of them is that I was way out back alone in the winter, paddling along, and the next thing I am aware of is there's a couple big black eyes looking at me behind me. And, it was a seal. I'd never seen a seal in Strathmere. And I tried to stop, and but he just totally disappeared. He was gone, which makes sense. So I paddle all the way back, and I'm coming up the bay, and I just stopped paddling for a minute. For some dumb reason, I just turned around, and there he is. He followed me all the way back. It was just, it's just something that you'll never forget. Another one is even, gives me chills just to think about. I was paddling in the inlet in the summer, and it was dark. It was really dark. And I just, stopped paddling for a minute. And the next thing I know, my favorite bird, which is the black skimmer, in a whole flock, I saw them coming at me, probably 6 or 8 of them with their beaks in the water. And I just don't move, and the next thing I know, they all just rise and then go back, and they continued on their work. It was just an obstacle as far as they were concerned. But for me, it was fantastic. Yeah, kayaking here is a wonderful thing to do. It's just a wonderful thing. You got anything else?
Yeah, talk about your love of the celestial and what sets us apart here and why.
Yeah, very early on, years and years ago, before I moved here, I lived up in the mountains in Morgantown, Pennsylvania, and had a big deck we put on the back of the house, and we bought, real honest to God, redwood hot tub. And we put it in the deck, and at night we would go out and sit in the hot tub year-round and look up, and the sky was just a maze of stars, just billions of them, the Milky Way, everything. So, I got really excited about that, and when we got the house down here and sold that house up there, my brother-in-law, Rob Zaccardi, was selling his house up in Philadelphia, and he's the reason I bought the hot tub, because he said, if we buy 2, we can become dealers. So we bought the 2, and Chris and I, my son, put ours in Morgantown. He put his in his house, and now the house was being sold. The people didn't want the hot tub, so I got the hot tub and put it in the back deck. Well, if I thought that was good in the mountains, it was unbelievably good here. even with the light pollution out of Atlantic City, the stars at night here are spectacular. And you know, this is a real hot tub, so it's, you know, 4 feet deep. You know, you keep it going year round because you can. And it was just a wonderful experience. It made the whole place different. I've got a good telescope. Started looking at the stars, tried to memorize the constellations. Always could orient myself. So it's a great hobby.
Tell us a little bit about what it's like to live on this inlet and how the inlet impacts this street.
Yeah. There's no better and no worse place to live. My sense of even anybody living on a barrier island is that we are very temporary guests. And I feel like we don't belong here. You know, there's plenty of other places to live, but there's no more wonderful place to live than here, and that's why so many people want to do it. But, you know, the good Lord's going to do what he wants with it. I mean, he created them, and he's going to move them, because that's what barrier islands do. They move. And so I always felt, you know, I never worried about losing the place because I looked at every day as such a gift. And so what happens with the inlet? The inlet is a nasty, nasty place when it wants to be, and it's a very lovely place when it wants to be. In fact, I don't know if this story is true. I know, I believe that Eddie Anders's father was killed in the inlet, and he lived here and knew everything about it. It's a no messing around deal. And the other thing that happens is the inlet clearly is it's something that we're not going to tame. And you know, right now the Lord wants to put lots of sand in the bay, and that's what's happening, and that's going to continue to happen. I feel like we've got it under control somewhat now, but we're fighting a tough fight. But I think it looks like it's pretty stable now. They did dredge the inlet this time for the first time in 30 years. So it seems better than it has been.
In all your years of living here, how close did the inlet get to your property?
It got, well, that's a whole story. I'll do it real quick. Basically, inlets have a way of wanting to move south. And so a couple, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, it decided it was going to move south, and it did it by cutting the tip off the inlet by channeling the water closer to the houses. And at this time, it was somewhat similar to what happened back in the '63 storm, I guess it was. And most of the houses, old houses here, Sylvan Tompkins' house, this house, the one on the end where the Shermers lived, it took their garages. And back then there was a guy who, nothing was being done. Shermer's house was about to go in, and he had a bulldozer, so he just, as a neighbor, came up and started bulldozing sand around the bottom of the house and saved the house. Well, it was after that that the state decided that they were going to put a bulkhead in on the whole ocean side and you know, charge people over a 10-year period or something to pay for the bulkhead. So the whole ocean side was bulkheaded. The bay side was largely bulkheaded with private bulkheads. What was not bulkheaded was the Seaview Road tip of the, and because it never came that close. But when that channel changed, it got close. And in fact, it got so close that Al Lord up at the end hired a contractor and put in steel bulkhead. But it was illegal. And Al just told the DEP, fine me, I'm not going to lose my house. And they came down and gave him an emergency permit. I thought this was great because everybody else on the street wanted to put it in, so I went to the DEP and I said, we need that emergency permit too. And they went, no, we're going to truck in sand. So they put in, I don't know, hundreds of truckloads of sand. It was gone in 3 months. And so us neighbors, including the township street end, decided that it had to have a bulkhead. And they kept putting sand in, and finally we hired, the same lawyer that Al had, and waited. And finally, we decided we got to pull the trigger because we had already contracted for work, all the steel was available, and just notified the DEP that we're doing it.
What approximate years here? Give us a
Years
time
go
frame.
flashing by, but I guess it's probably been eight years or 9 years when that was done.
And the rocks.
Yeah, well, what happened then is that they sent somebody down to look at it, and they gave us a permit that day. And 2 days later, we had the contractor here bulkheading the whole back of the, and then there was what we called back then the Mother's Day storm. And the bulkhead held beautifully, but if it hadn't been there, these houses would have been sticking out. Anybody that was on pilings, it just would have been way up on pilings. I mean, it would have just taken it all. Mm-hmm. And then the state realized that they needed more than just the steel bulkhead, so they brought in, giant stones the size of Volkswagens. And now it's a firm, solid wall. There's no problem now. And since then they've, got smart about doing the replenishment. What do they call it? Nurturing or something like that. I love euphemisms. So it's not going to go anywhere now.
Maybe I would like you to talk a little bit about your very good friend Betty Disher, because she's gone now, and it would be nice to hear a little bit about who she was and what she represented and her personality and that sort of thing.
Wow.
How she got here.
You got a week? Met Betty when we were renting the house in 1979 because her family home was just 2 down from where we were on Tecumseh renting. And Joe Coffey lived in a little house on the beach, and he had a big boat in Cape May called the Java. And we were invited out with Joe and Betty to go fishing. And that's the first time that I, had met Betty. And Betty she is one of the most unique people I've ever met in my life. She had an interesting, fantastically interesting history and life. She and her best friend in town, Elizabeth Bergus, lived across the street from each other. And
As children.
as children, right? And she liked to say that she was conceived here. And basically, the families were, they were comfortable in terms of money. Elizabeth's father was the name. His name is Ravden, and he was actually the heart surgeon for Harry Truman. So he's quite renowned. Betty's father ran a construction company, And at that time, there were about 7 or 8 families that had black nannies or housekeepers that would come from Philadelphia, where they lived in the winter, down here as well. She said they were just unbelievably wonderful. So they were the people who were raising her. And but they would get Wednesday afternoons off. And that they would do things as kids, like going up when the train was coming in and actually help the guys, because it wasn't a drawbridge, it was a turn bridge, and it would have to be cranked. Other stories like that, the whale and fishing clubs, and the whole business of what it was like back then. So that was my first introduction to Betty. When, we bought the home, people were really upset with us because we didn't have any money and we had to rent it. And they didn't like when people would rent their houses here. They didn't like that. So there's nothing I can do. So just be patient. And 7 years later, 8 years later, I was a full-time resident, so I didn't have any trouble. I found that Betty was a really good friend of Gregory, who was a really young guy. He was a teenager at the time. And Gregory was just a super artist, and Betty, loved his work and bought a bunch of it, and they would hang out. But the thing that Betty was more than anything else was a fisherman. And she and Goggs, who was the post mistress at the time, who's Debbie Whipcamp's mother, and Debbie's grandmother, I guess, Bertha. Is it an aunt? Aunt Bertha, that's right, I forgot, Aunt Bertha. And they would always be competing for surf fishing. And you'd go in the post office and you'd see the handmade trophies about who caught the biggest fish in what year. So the other thing, which was a wonderful story, is that if there was what they called a blitz on the beach, that everybody in town, no matter what they were doing at that time, would run to the beach. And you'd see people, in all different, levels of formal or informal dress, throwing the rods in to catch whatever fish was in the blitz. It was a different time, much smaller community, different time. But Betty, her history is very, very interesting. She was one of the very first women to graduate from Penn State with a degree, I think, in chemistry. And that was unusual. But afterwards, she had a job at one of the cat houses at Penn State for, doing experiments on cats. She was a dog person, totally committed to her dogs, and they loved her more than she even loved them. It was amazing. Betty then, after college, wound up going into the Navy, and she got a very responsible job. She was in charge of taking the orders to the submarine bases because they weren't going to send them through communications channels, so she had to deliver them for the submarines' missions. And she had an armed guard with her, and she had a responsible job. In that job, she met Bill Disher, who was a non-com Marine who was also working his way up in the military. And they married, and Bill then got a position as the guy in charge of the the defense or the missions within all of the embassies in the Middle East. And they moved together to Lebanon. And she said it was such a fantastic country. I mean, it was like you could go skiing in the afternoon in the mountains and go to the beach the next morning. But what was so interesting about it was her friend, Elizabeth Bergus, and her husband, Donald, he was in charge of the mission in Egypt when we didn't have diplomatic relationships with Egypt. And he was located in the Swiss embassy. And Betty would go from Lebanon to visit, Elizabeth in Egypt. So it was a really interesting life. And that's where I think she got her wanderlust, because all through their life then, every year at least once, she would take some spectacularly odd and wonderful trip. So she's been all over the world. Bill and she split up, I don't know how long they were together, maybe 10 years or something like that. But they remained really, really good friends. So as Betty was getting older, she was becoming a little bit less able to do the things that she really loved to do. And, some people have a temperament that they just accommodate the fact that they can't do these things anymore. Betty did not accommodate well to that. She, to put it mildly, hated it. But she'd never say so. She'd never say so. But I think it bothered her, and she became, pretty cantankerous. So you really need to, you had to adjust to Betty, because Betty wasn't going to adjust to you. And if you loved her, it was no problem. And if you didn't, it was a big problem. And I just loved her because, we spent so much time together. It's like an odd couple kind of thing. But really, really wonderful person. In her own way, she was very warm. But she would turn cool really quickly if there was, something she considered BS. She just had no time for it. I miss her a lot. I miss her a whole lot. So that's the Betty story.